I remember the exact day your grandfather didn't come home. It lives in my bones the way winter lives in old houses, in the cracks and the drafty corners. That day never really ended for me, it just stretched itself over the years, thin and quiet, like a faded curtain. Tonight, I'm going to walk you through every hour of it, the ordinary morning, the waiting by the window, the phone call that broke the air in two, and how I somehow kept this family from falling apart. You've heard pieces of this story before, in whispers over the sink or during holidays when I went quiet at the head of the table. But I've never told you the whole thing, not like this. Are you sure you want to know what it really felt like to watch the clock and not have him walk through that door? It started as a simple day. That's the cruel part. There was nothing in the morning air that said, "Pay attention. This is the last time." Your grandfather was sitting exactly where you're sitting now, by the corner of the table. He had that chipped blue mug he always liked, the one with the little crack near the handle that only he trusted. The radio was murmuring in the background, some old song we both pretended not to like, even though we knew every word. He buttered his toast too slowly, like he had all the time in the world. I remember watching the knife slide back and forth and thinking he was going to be late for work if he didn't hurry. Isn't it strange what you notice when you don't know you're noticing something for the last time? Your coffee's getting cold, I told him. He just smiled that little sideways smile and said, "Then I'll drink it faster." Do you know how many times I replay that tiny exchange in my head? Just those 7 words. As if I could go back and change them into something wiser, something bigger, something worthy of being the last thing I'd say before he walked out. He stood up, kissed the top of my head, and said, "I'll be home by 6. Don't wait dinner on me if I'm a little late." 6. Such an ordinary hour. Not heroic, not dramatic. Just 6. I wiped crumbs off the table and told him, "You always say that, and I always wait." We both laughed. God, we laughed. If I had known what that promise would cost me, would I still have said it? He grabbed his coat from the hook, yes, that same hook by the door that still leans a little to the left, and he slipped his arms into it like he'd done 1,000 times before. The fabric made that soft swishing sound. He smelled like soap and coffee and a hint of the cologne he only wore on weekdays. And then he turned back. Do you remember that little framed picture on the wall, the one of our first car? He glanced at it, just for a second. I didn't think anything of it. Later, I would lie awake wondering if he'd known somehow, if that glance was his way of saying goodbye not just to me, but to the life he'd built. He opened the door, and the morning light rushed in, pale and cool. He said, "Lock the door after me. You never know these days." I rolled my eyes. Your grandfather was always cautious, and I said, "Just go, you're late." He chuckled, stepped outside, and the door clicked shut. That was it. That tiny sound. That was the last time I heard your grandfather close that door from the outside. For a moment, the house exhaled. The radio hummed, and somewhere down the street, a dog barked. I stood there with my hand on the edge of the table, feeling the warmth from where he'd been sitting. Nothing felt wrong yet. Nothing felt strange. I washed the dishes in the sink, the same sink where my hands tremble a little now. The water was too hot, and I kept my hands in it anyway. I hummed the song from the radio without thinking. Isn't it cruel that the worst days of our lives start like any other? As the morning rolled into afternoon, little things happened and slipped away. I folded laundry. I wiped down the stove. I called your mother, she was younger than you are now, and we talked about nothing, groceries, the weather, a school project she was worried about. None of us knew the ground had already cracked beneath our feet. Around 3, the light in the kitchen started to change. It tilted, turned more golden, and the shadows from the window stretched across the floor. That was always the part of the day when I started thinking about him coming home, how his key would scrape in the lock, how he would stomp his boots if it had rained, how he would call out, "I'm home," like it was a victory. But that day, something very small shifted. I glanced at the clock, and a little knot formed behind my ribs. It was nothing more than a flutter, a tiny unease. He wasn't late. Not really. But the day felt off, like a picture that's hanging just a little crooked. Have you ever felt that way and not known why? I told myself I was being silly. Men get stuck in traffic. They stop for gas. They see a friend and talk 5 minutes too long. So I busied myself. I cut vegetables. I seasoned the chicken. I set 3 plates on the table, mine, his, and a spare, just in case your mother decided to drop by. The table looked hopeful. That's the only way I know how to put it. It looked like it was expecting him. At 5:30, the house grew quieter, even though nothing really changed. The radio was off. The clock kept ticking. I turned on a lamp even though it wasn't dark yet. I've always hated that gray half-light, when the day doesn't want to admit it's almost over. I went to the front window. That window has seen too much, you know. I pushed back the curtain and looked out onto the street. Cars rolled by, neighbors walked dogs, a boy on a bicycle raced past with his backpack bouncing. But not him. Not his car. I told myself, he said 6. Stop fussing. I went back to the kitchen and stirred the pot on the stove. The smell of garlic and onions filled the house, heavy and comforting. That smell still brings me right back to that evening. Food waiting for someone who never arrives. 5:45. My heart started to tap a little faster. It wasn't panic yet, not even close. Just awareness. A sharpening of sound. Every car that slowed outside made me lift my head. Every door slam in the neighborhood made me think, that's him. And each time, it wasn't. Do you know what it feels like when the ordinary begins to feel wrong, but you can't explain it? When your mind is calm, but your body has already started grieving something it hasn't even lost yet? 6 o'clock arrived like an accusation. I remember standing under the kitchen clock, watching the minute hand slide over the 12. The second hand ticked on, completely unconcerned. 6. The time he promised. The time he'd said so casually at breakfast, like it was nothing. The chicken was done. The table was set. The window was waiting. And there was no sound of keys at the door. I gave it 5 minutes. 5 turned into 10. 10 turned into 15. I told myself, traffic. It's just traffic. But the words tasted thin. Something in me snapped to attention. I wiped my hands on the dish towel, then went back to that front window and pushed the curtain aside again. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker on, one by one, throwing pale yellow halos on the sidewalk. The sky was bruised purple at the edges. Cars still passed, but fewer now. I watched every one, holding my breath as it turned the corner near our driveway. None of them slowed. None of them turned in. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass. The window smelled faintly of cleaner and dust. Outside, someone's wind chimes clinked softly in the breeze. Inside, the clock in the hall ticked loud enough to feel like a heartbeat. My eyes started to sting, not from tears yet, but from not blinking, from staring down a road that kept giving me strangers. Come on, I whispered. Where are you? Have you ever whispered to someone who isn't there yet, as if your voice could pull them closer? As if your longing could bend the road? I stayed there longer than I meant to. The pain grew colder against my skin as the sun sank. Street lamps buzzed to life. A neighbor across the street brought out their trash bin. The normalness of it all scraped against me. Finally, I pulled myself away and decided to call him at work. That was my line in the sand, my proof that I wasn't overreacting. In the hallway, the old beige telephone waited on its little table, its cord curled like a sleeping cat's tail. My hand hovered over it for a second. It felt like picking it up would make my worry real. But I did it anyway. I dialed the number I knew by heart. 1 ring. 2. 3. 4. No answer. On the 5th, someone finally picked up, but it wasn't him. It was a young man, nervous sounding, like he'd only just started working there. Hello, he said. Hi, this is. I said my name slowly, carefully, like it mattered how the letters came out. Is he still there? He hasn't come home yet. There was a pause. I heard papers shuffling. Phones ringing faintly in the background. Then the young man said, "No, ma'am, he left on time. Around 4:30. 4:30. 2 hours ago." My grip on the phone tightened. Are you sure? Yes, ma'am. I remember. He said he was headed straight home. Straight home. The words landed heavy. They didn't fit with the empty driveway, the untouched plate on the table. All right, I managed. Thank you. I hung up very gently, like any sudden movement might shatter the evening. That was the first real moment I knew something was wrong. Not imagined. Not overcautious. Wrong. Do you know how sometimes the world seems to tilt, just a degree or two, so you feel like you're standing on a slight, invisible slope? That's how my hallway felt. Like everything wanted to slide away from me. I went back to the living room and sat in his armchair instead of mine. I almost never did that when he was here. It felt strange, like borrowing someone else's heartbeat. The chair smelled like him. Fabric softener, aftershave, that faint trace of machine oil from his work. I pressed my cheek against it and closed my eyes for a long breath. Then I opened them and looked at the clock again. 6:30. I told myself, if he's not home by 7, I'll call someone else. Who? The police? The hospital? A friend? I didn't know. I only knew I needed another line, another step to not feel helpless. Time became thick. The minutes didn't tick, they dragged. I stood up, sat down, walked circles in the kitchen. I moved his plate slightly to the left, then back again. I turned the stove down to keep the food warm, then turned it off altogether. 7 o'clock came and went, slipping past me like a stranger brushing against my shoulder on a dark street. That was when fear stopped being a whisper and became a voice. I picked up the phone again, this time with shaking hands. I called one of his co-workers, the one who sometimes joined him for lunch. No answer. I tried another. He hadn't seen him after work. Each conversation added another stone to the pile in my chest. The pile that said, "This isn't nothing." I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? My husband is an hour late? People are late all the time. Men come home late. Cars break down. Phones die. Maybe he'd stop for groceries, I told myself. Maybe he'd run into an old friend. But the picture in my head wouldn't stay simple. It kept flashing to darker possibilities, ones I tried to swat away like moths near a lamp. I went back to the window. Of course I did. Where else does a heart go when it's waiting? The world outside had slipped fully into night now. The street was softer, edges blurred by the dark. Headlights swept by in glimpses. I stood there, my fingertips pressing little half-moons into the curtain fabric. Every set of headlights made my breath hitch. Every brake light made my knees weaken with hope. And every time it wasn't him, the hope didn't just fade, it cracked. Tiny hairline fractures running through me. I started talking to him in my head. If you're stuck, just call. If you're hurt, just let someone find you. If you're angry, if we fought and I forgot, just come home and we'll fix it. We hadn't fought. There had been no sharp words, no slammed doors. Isn't that strange? Heartbreak with no warning shot. Finally, my body demanded something, anything, to do. So I left the window and walked to the front door. I opened it just enough to peer out onto the porch. The night air rushed in, cool and smelling faintly of damp earth and gasoline. The driveway stared back at me. Empty. I stepped out, just 1 foot on the porch, as if going any farther might mean crossing a line I couldn't return from. The world felt too big, too open. I wanted to shout his name down the street, but my voice wouldn't come. Instead, I whispered it once, under my breath, just to hear how it sounded in the night. I went back inside and locked the door like he'd told me that morning. Those words echoed now, strange and sharp, "Lock the door after me." You never know these days. 7:30. 8. 8:30. The hours piled up. I didn't turn on the television. Noise felt like disrespect to the quiet fear that had settled over the house. I just moved between the window, the clock, and the empty chair, as if walking some small, sad triangle. At some point, I sat on the edge of our bed and realized I was still wearing the same apron I'd tied on that afternoon. The knot dug into my back. I untied it slowly, folded it over my lap, and stared at the phone on the nightstand. "Call the hospital," a little voice inside me said. "Just in case." I hated that voice. I hated what it implied. But I picked up the phone anyway. My fingers felt clumsy on the numbers. I called the first hospital I could think of. A nurse with a tired voice answered. I gave her his name, spelling it carefully, my voice shaking only on the last letter. "I'm sorry," she said after a pause. "We don't have anyone by that name." The relief that washed through me was strange and incomplete, like opening a door and finding not your worst fear but still not what you hoped for. I thanked her and hung up, but the thought wouldn't leave. What if I'd called the wrong hospital? What if it was another one, farther away? I sat there, phone still in my hand, and the house was so quiet I swear I could hear my own pulse. And then, sometime after 9, the phone rang. You know that sound. But you can't know how it felt that night. It wasn't just a ring. It was a knife in the quiet. It was the air gasping. It was everything stopping at once. I froze. My hand hovered over the receiver for a second that felt like an entire year. Who would be calling at that hour? If it were him, why hadn't he called sooner? If it wasn't him, then who could it be? I picked up the phone, my voice caught somewhere between hope and dread. "Hello?" On the other end, there was a pause. Just a breath, but long enough for my heart to decide it hated silence forever. "Is this Mrs.?" The man said my name, careful and formal. His voice was steady, but there was something thick in it, something weighted. "Yes," I said, and the word felt like stepping onto fragile ice. "This is Officer," he said his name, but to this day, I can't remember it. My mind brushed past it, straight to the word that came after. "There's been an accident." The room tilted. Not dramatically, not like in the movies. Just slightly, enough to make me reach for the wall. I didn't even sit down. I felt like if I sat down, I'd never stand up again. What kind of accident?" I heard myself ask. My voice sounded far away, like it was echoing off the kitchen tiles and back to me. "There was a collision on the highway," he said carefully. People always use careful words for ugly things. "Your husband's car was involved." My heart heard it even before my mind did. "Is he all right? Is he in the hospital?" "Which one?" I called. There was another pause. Later, I would think of that pause as the last second in which my life was still the same. "I'm very sorry, ma'am," he said. He didn't make it. He didn't make it. Such a small sentence to end a whole world. For a moment, the line went quiet. I couldn't hear his breathing. I couldn't hear mine. I couldn't hear the clock, the refrigerator, the car passing outside. Everything went flat and white and empty. Do you know that moment in winter when you step outside and the air is so cold it steals your breath away? That's what those words did. They froze everything. "I'm sorry," he repeated. "We tried to reach you sooner. There was a delay in." I don't remember what delayed them. Paperwork, procedure, getting the right address. What I remember is the loose thread of the phone cord under my fingers and how I wound it around and around until it burned my skin. "No," I said. Not loudly. Just, no. A simple word against a simple sentence, both too small for what they were carrying. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he said again. He asked if there was someone with me. He told me they would need me to come in, to identify. I couldn't let my mind touch that word yet. I answered when I had to. I said yes, I understood. Yes, I would come. Yes, I was alone. The conversation ended, and I set the phone back on its cradle as gently as if it were made of glass. Then I just stood there. That's something no one tells you about grief. The first thing it does is make you stand very, very still. Like if you don't move, maybe time will rewind itself a few minutes and the phone will never ring. The clock on the wall ticked once. Twice. 3 times. And then, without really meaning to, I walked back to the window. I don't know why. He wasn't going to pull into the driveway. I knew that now, in the cold, metallic way you know a fact on paper. But some softer part of me hadn't caught up yet. Some part of me still believed that if I looked out and saw his car turn the corner, this could all be a terrible mistake. Outside, the street looked exactly the same as it had an hour before. The same streetlights. The same wind. A stray cat darted across the road, its shadow long and thin. The world had the audacity to go on as if nothing had happened. I placed my palm flat against the glass. It was so cold it almost hurt. And then the tears came. They didn't burst out, not at first. They slipped down, quiet and stunned, like they, too, couldn't believe what had happened. Have you ever cried so silently that the only sound in the room is the clock? I pressed my forehead against the window and let myself cry for exactly 1 minute. I don't know how I knew it was a minute, but I did. After that, something inside me clicked into a different gear. Because suddenly, it wasn't just about me. You see, that day didn't just happen to a wife waiting by the window. It happened to a father who had children who needed him, and when he couldn't come home, someone else had to step into the space he left behind. I stepped away from the window, wiped my face with the back of my hand, and looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. His chair. His mug in the sink. His plate still waiting on the table. The little trail of his life, ending in mid-step. I knew I would have to make phone calls now. Your mother. Your uncle. My sister. Each call would make it more real. Each time I said the words out loud, they would carve a little deeper. I picked up the phone again, and for a second, my fingers hovered. How do you tell your child that their father isn't coming home? How do you take a word like gone and put it into a sentence that points at someone they love? I dialed anyway. What choice did I have? Your mother answered on the second ring, bright and distracted. She said my name the way she always did, a little question at the end, as if asking, "What's up? Are you sitting down?" I asked her. My voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. She laughed a little, nervous. "Mom, what's going on? You're scaring me." I remember looking at the chair across from me and wishing more than anything that your grandfather was in it, rolling his eyes at how dramatic I was being. But he wasn't. He would never be again. "There's been an accident," I said. The words felt like ash. Silence. "What do you mean?" she finally said, her voice small. He didn't make it," I forced out. "He's gone." On the other end, a sound escaped her. Half sob, half disbelief. I heard something fall, a cup, maybe, or a chair, then footsteps, someone else's voice in the background asking what was wrong. In that moment, I wanted to take the words back. To say, no, I was wrong, it's all a mistake. But I couldn't. The truth had already left my mouth. I stayed on the line as long as I could, until I was sure she wasn't alone, until I heard someone else's voice steadying hers. Then I made the next call, and the next. Each time, the story became a little more practiced, but not easier. Grief doesn't get easier with repetition, it just gets more familiar. By the time the last call was made, the food on the stove was cold, and the air in the house felt thick, like wading through honey. I sat at the table and stared at his plate. The way the silverware was arranged. The empty glass beside it. I thought about throwing it all away, sweeping the plates into the trash, slamming the pot into the sink. Instead, I did something stranger. I fixed myself a small plate. I put a little chicken, a spoonful of vegetables, a piece of bread. Then I sat down at my place, across from the space where he should have been, and I forced myself to eat 3 bites. They tasted like cardboard. But in some deep, quiet place, I knew I needed strength for what came next. I knew that if I let myself fall apart completely, there would be no one left to hold the pieces of this family together. When you're the one left standing, you don't get the luxury of collapsing, not all at once. Sometimes survival is just choosing to stand up when the world sits down. Late that night, your mother arrived, eyes red, face crumpled, shoulders shaking. I held her the way I had when she was a little girl with scraped knees, except this time, there was no band-aid big enough. We didn't talk much. Words felt small. She kept looking at the front door, as if expecting him to walk through and say this was all some terrible misunderstanding. I understood. I'd been doing the same thing with my eyes, even while my heart knew better. "Are you sure?" she asked me at one point, voice cracking. "I heard it from the officer himself," I said. "They need us to come in tomorrow." Tomorrow. A day that would involve papers, and signatures, and that terrible, terrible room where they ask you, "Is this him?" We barely slept. At some point, she lay down on the couch, and I sat in the armchair, his armchair, wrapped in an old blanket that still smelled faintly of him. The house creaked in the dark, the way old houses do. Each sound tugged at my nerves. Have you ever been so tired and so sad at the same time that your body feels like it's made of wet sand? Heavy, shapeless, too exhausted to move but too restless to be still? That's what that night was. Morning came anyway. It always does. The light through the window was cruelly bright, as if nothing had happened. The clock ticked. The birds outside sang. Somewhere down the street, a car engine started. The world didn't know we'd lost our center. We dressed in clothes that didn't feel like ours. Your mother wore black even though it was too soon to call it morning clothes, they just felt right. I buttoned my blouse 3 times before I got it right. My fingers wouldn't cooperate. At the station, everything smelled like coffee and paper and tired people. The officer from the phone met us with that same heavy sympathy in his eyes. He walked us through halls, down corridors that all looked the same. I felt like I was floating, untethered. Like one of those balloons that slips from a child's hand and drifts up, 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 while everyone on the ground just watches it go. There are parts of that day I will never describe to you in full. Not because you couldn't handle them, but because some images belong behind closed doors of the heart. Some things, once spoken, never stop echoing. But I will tell you this, there was no doubt it was him. I touched his hand, cool and still, and all at once, the reality crashed in like a wave. All the little moments from that morning, the mug, the toast, the silly joke about cold coffee, rose up and wrapped around me like a tide. I whispered something to him then. I have never repeated it to anyone. It was mine, and his, and that was enough. We signed papers. We answered questions. We nodded at sympathetic faces. People offered us water, tissues, that tight-lipped kindness reserved for fresh grief. And then, finally, we walked back out into the daylight that felt too ordinary for what we'd just done. The real work of holding a family together doesn't begin in the moment of loss. It begins right after, when everyone is still stunned and numb, and there are decisions to be made, about funerals and flowers and who calls who and what happens next. We drove home in silence. Your mother stared out the window, her hands clenched in her lap. I kept both hands tight on the steering wheel, knuckles white, as if I could control anything at all by gripping harder. Back at the house, people started to arrive. Family, friends, neighbors who had heard and couldn't stay away. They came with casseroles and dishes they hoped they'd never see again, as if leaving the dish behind could mean leaving a piece of their support. The living room filled with low voices, the smell of coffee, the rustle of tissues. People hugged us, patted our backs, said all the things people say. He was a good man. We're so sorry. If you need anything. I nodded. I thanked them. I made sure everyone had something to drink. I answered the same questions repeatedly, as gently as I could. Yes, it was sudden. No, we hadn't known anything was wrong. Yes, he seemed fine that morning. Inside, I felt like I'd been hollowed out and replaced with wind. But here's the strange part, in the middle of all that, I found a kind of strength I didn't know I had. When your uncle broke down in the hallway, I went to him. When your mother couldn't stop shaking, I held her hands. When someone started arguing quietly in the kitchen about logistics, who would do what, when the service would be, I stepped in, calm and firm. It wasn't because I was less sad. It was because I was the one who had waited by the window. I had already done my breaking, alone, in that first long night. Now, somehow, I was the glue. Love doesn't end when a heartbeat does, it just changes its work. Days blurred. We chose a suit for him to be buried in, the navy one he always said made him feel too fancy, the one he wore to weddings and graduations. We picked out hymns and readings and photographs. Your grandfather's smile looked back at us from glossy prints. Younger, older, thinner, grayer, each version a different chapter of the same story. Seeing them on the table like that felt like watching his life laid out in pieces, like a puzzle we'd finished too soon. The funeral was full. That's the word that comes to mind. Full of people, full of flowers, full of memories. Tears, yes, but also laughter, the kind that slips out when someone tells a story you'd forgotten. One man stood up and told everyone about the time your grandfather had stayed late to help him fix his car in the parking lot after a long shift, even though it made him miss dinner. I remembered that night. I'd been so annoyed. I'd had a pot roast waiting. Standing there, listening, I realized how much of your grandfather's life had taken place outside the walls of our home, how many people he had quietly helped, how many stories he was a side character in. It hurt, but it also helped. Because in those days after he didn't come home, it would have been easy to see only the hole he left. But story by story, I began to see the outline of the man who had filled that space so well. The hardest part wasn't the funeral, though. Funerals give you something to focus on, a purpose buried inside the sadness. The hardest part was the day after, when everyone went back to their lives. The house was suddenly too quiet again. No casseroles, no visitors, no reason to get up early except the ones I'd always had, laundry, dishes, bills. Except now, everything was heavier because I was carrying it alone. I walked into the kitchen that first morning after, and for a second, I expected to see him at the table, coffee steaming, radio on. The absence hit me so hard I had to grab the counter to steady myself. I made 1 cup of coffee instead of 2. I sat at the table with the radio off. The chair across from me stayed empty, its cushion puffed slightly from years of use. Grief lives in the little changes, you know. In the extra fork you don't take out of the drawer. In the half-empty closet. In the way you automatically say, we, and then have to correct yourself to I. For a while, nights were the worst. I would lie in bed and listen to the sounds of the house, the pipes, the wind, the odd car outside, and every creak felt like him almost coming back. Almost walking down the hall. Almost opening the bedroom door. I kept turning toward his side of the bed in the dark, reaching out a hand before I remembered. The cold space there was like a second pillow of sadness. But even in those first weeks, there were small, stubborn signs of life. Your mother would call and tell me how the children, your cousins, and one day, you, asked about Grandpa. She'd tell them stories. The one about him dancing in the kitchen with a dish towel. The one about him fixing a broken swing with nothing but a rope and determination. I started telling stories too. Not just the big ones, but the tiny ones, how he whistled when he was nervous. How he always saved the last fry for me. How he pretended not to like the neighbor's cat, but I'd catch him sneaking its scraps. The more we talked, the more he became something other than the man who died in a car accident. He was the man who lived with us, laughed with us, annoyed us, loved us. And that, in its own quiet way, helped hold us together. I won't pretend it was easy. There were days I didn't want to get out of bed. Days when the weight of being the strong one felt like too much. Days when I resented the very people I was trying to protect, because their need for me meant I couldn't shatter the way I sometimes wanted to. But each morning, I would stand at that same window where I'd waited the night he didn't come home, and I would open the curtains. I'd let the light in, even when I didn't feel ready for it. One day, I saw your uncle walking up the driveway with his little boy, your cousin, swinging a lunchbox. The boy ran ahead, straight to me, and asked, "Grandma, can I have a cookie?" I laughed. It startled me, that laugh. It had been a while. That's when I knew, I thought, I'm still here. We're still here. Years passed. We learned new ways of being a family without him. Holidays changed shape. Traditions bent and reformed. I took over some of his tasks, paying certain bills, fixing leaky faucets, not because I wanted to, but because someone had to. Every once in a while, something would break, literally, and I'd find myself standing there with a wrench in my hand, talking to the ceiling. "All right, old man," I'd say. "This was your job, remember?" Sometimes I'd get it wrong. I'd tighten the wrong screw or forget to turn off the right valve, and water would go everywhere. I'd curse, mop it up, and then laugh through the tears, imagining what he would have said. That's how love keeps talking after the person is gone. It fills in their lines for them. You want to know something strange? Over time, the memory of the night he didn't come home stopped being the only thing that defined that day. When I think of that day now, I remember the morning too. The silly coffee joke. The way the sunlight hit his hair at the kitchen table. The warmth of his hand on my shoulder as he kissed the top of my head. If you only hold on to the moment of loss, you lose the whole story that came before it. So I began to tell myself the story differently. Not as the day he didn't come home, but as the last day we shared an ordinary morning. That doesn't make the ending hurt less. But it widens the frame. It lets in more light. Now, when I sit by that window, and you've seen me there, in the afternoons, just staring out, I'm not always back in that night. Sometimes, I'm back in a summer morning 20 years before, or a snowy evening when he came home early and we made cocoa. Grief is a long road. It doesn't go in a straight line. It loops and doubles back. Some days, it's a soft ache, like an old bruise. Other days, it's sharp again, fresh as that first phone call. But you know what it never did? It never broke this family. Not really. We bent. We cracked in places. We reshaped ourselves around the hole he left. But we didn't break. Because every time it felt like we might shatter, someone reached for someone else's hand. Your mother reached for mine. Your uncle reached for her. One day, many years later, you reached for me. And each time, that touch said, "We're still here. We're still us, even without him." The day your grandfather didn't come home changed everything. It taught me how thin the line is between ordinary and shattered. It taught me that waiting by a window can feel like the hardest job in the world. It taught me that a single phone call can divide your life into before and after. But it also taught me this: strength doesn't always look like big speeches or grand gestures. Sometimes, strength is small and quiet. It's making a plate of food you don't want and eating 3 bites anyway. It's opening the curtains in the morning. It's telling a child a story about their grandfather and making sure you smile at the funny parts. You asked me once, "Grandma, how did you do it? How did you not fall apart?" The truth is, I did fall apart. Many times. In the laundry room, alone, with my hands buried in a pile of towels that still smelled like him. In the car, at red lights, when a song came on the radio that we used to dance to. In the grocery store, the first time I realized I didn't need to buy his favorite cereal anymore. But every time I fell apart, I remembered you. Your mother. Your uncle. All the people who loved him and still needed someone to keep the lights on, the bills paid, the stories told. So I would take a deep breath, wipe my face, and step back into the kitchen, or the living room, or the front porch, and I would say, all right. One more day. That's all any of us ever really do, you know. One more day. And then another. So now, as I sit here with you, telling you this story in full for the first time, I want you to understand something. The day your grandfather didn't come home was the worst day of my life. But it was not the last day of my life. I kept living. We kept living. We carried him forward in 1,000 small ways, in your mother's stubbornness, in your uncle's laugh, in the way you wrinkle your nose when you're thinking hard, just like he did. We carried him in recipes and in jokes, in pictures on the wall and in the quiet way we sometimes all glance at his chair before we sit down. If you are ever, one day, standing by a window waiting for someone who is late, feeling that slow, creeping fear wrap around your ribs, I hope you remember this story. Not to scare you, but to remind you that even if the worst happens, even if the phone rings and the news is bad, you are not made of glass. You will break, yes. But you can also mend. And if you ever wonder how, you can think of me at this table, on that long, terrible night, holding the phone in one hand and the curtain in the other, and choosing, over and over, to keep breathing. To keep cooking. To keep calling. To keep loving the people who were still here. Because that, in the end, is how I kept this family together. Not with any magic or wisdom. Just with small, stubborn acts of love, repeated day after day. If this story has settled somewhere in your own heart tonight, if it has reminded you of someone you're missing, I want to ask you to do something for me. Take a moment after this and tell someone a story about them. Say their name. Remember their laugh. Let their love keep doing its work through you. And if you'd like more nights like this, more slow, honest stories about the dust of old days and the people we've loved and lost, then please, take a second to like this video and support Dust of Old Days. It helps these stories find the people who need them. And if you haven't yet, you can subscribe to Dust of Old Days so that whenever a new story is ready, another grandmother at another table, sharing another piece of a life, you'll be there to hear it. We're building something gentle here, one memory at a time. As for me, I'll probably be back at that window tomorrow afternoon, the same way I have been for years. Not waiting for him anymore, but keeping watch over the street he used to come down, over the house we built together, over the family that somehow kept standing. Because some part of me believes that as long as I keep looking out, as long as I keep telling these stories, he never fully leaves. And now, neither does this day. It lives with you, too. So when you get up from this table, and you switch off this screen, and you walk down your own hallway toward your own life, remember. The day your grandfather didn't come home may have broken our hearts. But it did not break our family. We did that. We chose that. One ordinary, stubborn, loving day at a time.